We have reached the final chapter, Chapter 17, Death, Dying, and Grieving. In the United States, it's not uncommon to reach adulthood without having seen someone die. Individuals are more conscious of death in times of war, famine, and plague. Most societies throughout history have had philosophical or religious beliefs about death, and most societies have a ritual that deals with death. In most societies, death is not viewed as an end of existence. Though the biological body has died, the spiritual body is believed to live on. So in many ways, here in the United States, we can be called death avoiders or death deniers. The funeral industry glosses over death and fashions lifelike qualities in the dead. There's a persistent search for the fountain of youth. There's rejection and isolation of the aged who may remind us of death. These are some of the reasons why, in the U.S., we are considered death avoiders and death deniers. We have that adoption of the concept of pleasant and rewarding afterlife, suggesting that we are immortal. And then finally, medical communities emphasize that there's a prolonged biological life instead of diminishing human suffering. How is death defined? Well, we can define death and life-death issues in a variety of ways. One of the issues in determining death is whether or not your brain is functioning. So brain death is a neurological definition of death which states that a person is brain dead when all electrical activity of the brain has ceased for a specified period. A flat EEG recording for a specific period is one criteria of brain death. Because the brain's lower portion monitor heartbeat and respiration, individuals whose higher brain area have died may continue breathing and have a heartbeat. Some argue that the definition of death should include only higher cortical functioning, because of most human functions like intelligence and personality are located in this area. So of course, there's a debate going on as to how you would define death. There are decisions that have to be made regarding life, death, and health care. One of the things is a living will. The living will is designed to be completed while the individual is still able to think clearly. In that living will, they would express their desires regarding extraordinary medical procedures that may sustain life when medical situation becomes hopeless. Natural death legislation produced by concern over malpractice suits and people who support the living will. So what used to happen is that the doctors would make a decision, come to find out that it probably isn't what the patient wanted. And all of these are advanced care planning ideas. And that's the process of patients thinking about and communicating their preferences about end-of-life care. And the advance directive is also known as the living will. And that states such preferences as whether life-sustaining procedures should or should not be used to prolong life of an individual when death is imminent. And the living will is actually accepted in all 50 states. There's also physician orders for life-sustaining treatment, which is a POLST, and that's a document that's more specific than the advance directives. It actually translates treatment preferences into medical orders, such as those involving cardiopulmonary resuscitation, the extent of treatment, and artificial nutrition via a tube. Now, this POLST is only available and being considered in 34 of the states. Euthanasia. That's the act of painlessly ending the lives of individuals who are suffering from an incurable disease or a severe disability. It's sometimes known as mercy killing. And then there's two types of euthanasia. There's the passive euthanasia, and then there's the active euthanasia. So the passive occurs when a person is allowed to die by withholding available treatment, such as withdrawing a life-sustaining device. So that's kind of like when you take somebody off the ventilator. Okay, and then the active occurs when death is deliberately induced, as when a lethal dose of a drug is injected. Now, when we talk about euthanasia, I think most of the time we're talking about the passive. Even though, I would still say that's passive. Like, there's these technological advances in the life support devices that raise the issue of quality of life. The most widely publicized case of active euthanasia involves assisted suicide. So if you are helping somebody to die because you know that they're in pain, that's considered the active euthanasia. And the U.S. federal government has no official policy on assisted suicide and leaves the decision up to the states. And there's only 5 states, at least as of 2018, there were only 5 states that allowed assisted suicide. And that's Oregon, the state of Washington, Montana, New Mexico, and Vermont. Care providers increasingly are interested in helping individuals experience a good death, if there is such a thing as a good death. And there actually is, because what you want is you want that person to be as comfortable as possible. You don't want them to be alone, and you don't want their death to be prolonged and painful. So, because of that, the care providers try their best to provide physical comfort, support, the appropriate medical care. But when it gets down to the point where you know that you are coming close to death, there's a program called hospice, and they're committed to making the end of the life as free from pain, anxiety, and depression as possible. The goals of hospice contrast with those of a hospital, which are to cure illness and prolong life. So in a hospice, that's not what they're doing. They are emphasizing the palliative care, which is involved with reducing the pain and suffering that the individual might have, so that when they die, they can die with dignity. There are several different attitudes towards death as you go through the several lifespans. So the age always changes your perspective on death. So mature adult-like conception of death includes an understanding that death is final and irreversible, that death represents the end of life, and that all living things must die. So, as a mature adult, you know that this is the end of the cycle. There are several developmental perspectives on death, and our next video lecture will discuss what those developmental perspectives are.